Welcome to Backyard Oasis, a podcast designed by and for older adults living in the beautiful Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts and produced in the tech studios at Greenfield Community College in Greenfield, Massachusetts.
Hi, I'm Denise Schwartz, your host. My guest today is author Michael Miller. In his novel, High Bridge, he imagines what might happen if two 19th century historical figures with different childhoods and worldviews formed a friendship and combined their skills to solve a mystery and vindicate a person accused of murder. High Bridge tells the stories of Matilda Joslyn Gage, a young newlywed and the only child of freethinking abolitionists, and Grover Cleveland, a prankster lad who grows up in the large family of an austere reverend and who became president of the United States. Most of the story takes place in upstate New York, which in the mid-19th century was a cauldron bubbling with the lure of fast fortunes, religious activity, and battles for civil liberties. This fervor centers on the Erie Canal, which successfully supports scores of villages brimming with opportunity. One such village, Fayetteville, shapes the lives of the story's protagonists who become two future leaders of America. Now, before Michael begins to read High Bridge, let me tell you a little more about him. Like his two protagonists, he grew up in a small village with only a single road passing through it. Like young Grover Cleveland, Michael played baseball, had odd jobs such as delivering the daily newspaper, and he tramped through the local woods. Like Matilda Joslyn Gage, Michael learned to respect people regardless of their backgrounds, to appreciate the gifts each person brings to the world, and to learn through thorough research. Today, Michael continues to get joy from his family, exploring the outdoors, and satisfying his continuing curiosity by researching and writing historical novels. And Michael believes that you can teach an old dog new tricks. Hello, Michael.
Good morning. How are you?
Well, pretty good so far today. We've had a few glitches, but all in all, we're just moving forward pretty fast. So I want to say something. When I read about your book, I thought, this is one of those kind of what if mind exercises. What if this happened? What if that happened? In fact, historian Sally Rush, did I say her name correctly? Sally Rush?
Roche.
Sally Roche Wagner said, High Bridge, quote, is a thought-provoking journey into what might have resulted if suffragist Matilda Joslyn Gage and future President Grover Cleveland, who lived in the upstate village of Fayetteville at different times, had instead known each other and become friends. So I wondered, tell me, how was it that this idea came to you to create a story in which these two people crossed paths?
Happy to do that, and thank you for having me here and your interest in learning a little more about these two people and the book.
Yes.
So I lived in the area right near Fayetteville for about a dozen years, and as you're walking through an old village such as Fayetteville, which came about, I think it was founded like around the time of the Revolution.
Okay.
That there are some historical signs that say blah, 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 lived here.
Oh, sure.
Or something happened. So I was walking along and I saw a sign in front of a house that said Matilda Joslyn Gage lived here, an abolitionist, a women's suffrage warrior, and various other things. I said, oh, that's interesting. Who was she? Mm-hmm. And a short time later, on the other side of the street, maybe half a block away, there was another sign that said, Grover Cleveland grew up here, just down the street and on the left. I said, that's kind of weird. Two really well-known people. I may not know one of them, but I wasn't a history major, so I didn't really know much about it. And I said, that's got to be curious. And then I started thinking, I wonder if they knew each other. And there was the genesis of the book.
I love it. That's really wonderful. That kind of happens often, doesn't it? When you go someplace and you meet somebody and they say, I know somebody from somewhere, and you say, well, did you know blah, blah, blah
Exactly.
at that same time? I mean, that does happen more frequently than you think it would. So this is very plausible.
Right.
So tell us more about the story.
So the story imagines that the two of them knew each other, and when I started to do a little bit of research on it, the first thing was, when did they live and how and when would they in Fayetteville? As it happened, Grover Cleveland was born in Caldwell, New Jersey, and he was the fifth child in a family ultimately of 9. And he, by the time he was 4 years old, his father had gotten into a little bit of a fray with his congregation of Presbyterian congregation. And he eventually decided, I'm not as loved here as I would like to be and have my flock admiring me. So I'm going to go look for another job, and found one in Fayetteville.
Okay.
So Grover was 4 years old when they moved, and he lived in Fayetteville for about a dozen years,
Okay.
kind of like me.
Oh.
And he was there so until the early 1850s.
Oh, all right. I wanted that
So
time
through
frame.
the 40s and into the 50s.
Okay.
Into the 50s. Matilda, on the other hand, grew up in Cicero, New York, which is due north of Syracuse, as opposed to Fayetteville, which is due east of Syracuse. And that was where her entire childhood was, except for 1 year when she went to Clinton, New York,
Oh.
to go to 1 year of schooling.
Sure.
The rest of her time, she was schooled at home in Clinton. I'm sorry, in Cicero. She married, and then she moved to Syracuse and the area near Fayetteville, but she didn't move there until 1854, which is after Grover had left.
Oh, okay.
So I thought, this
It's
novel's
not
not
going to
going
happen.
anywhere.
Right.
And then I was talking to somebody about it, and I said, you're writing fiction, aren't you? You can do what you want.
I know.
So
That's
they
why
were
it's
there.
so much fun to write.
They were there at the same time, and that's where the big if came, and here it is.
So that's really important for readers of the book to really keep in mind. They both lived there, and they are real people, but they weren't there at the same time. So your imagination allowed them to be, and to keep that in mind as they're reading.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
And in the back of the book, for people who do read the book and want to be able to figure out what's true and what isn't, there is a part of the appendix that actually says what's true and what's not.
Oh.
So you can learn all about that. I try to put in as much historical fact in it to enrich in the story, but sometimes things had to be made up to make it work.
Well, I can't say that's any different from today. Oh, well, now, let's see. Tell us a little bit about what parts you're going to read from the book.
Okay, I'm going to read 2 parts, one for each of the 2 main characters, one for Matilda Joslyn Gage as an adult, and in the time when it kind of presents when she actually does meet Grover Cleveland in real life, and that's a true fact.
Oh,
So that's what the first reading would be. And then the second reading would be from Grover Cleveland's childhood, give a little sense of his puckishness and a sense of play and his just enjoying life.
all right.
All right?
Should we talk a little bit about how he became president? Or should we do that after you're done
Why don't we
reading?
do it after?
All right, that sounds
Afterward, kind of put that into context.
great. Okay, are you ready?
I'm ready when you are.
I'm ready.
All right. So the first reading is the prologue for the book.
Okay.
To try and set things up, and it takes place in Washington D.C. In the middle of March or end of March 25th in 1888.
Okay.
Grover Cleveland was president 2 times, for 2 different terms, I should say, from 85 to 89, and then again from 93 to 97, with a discontinuous 4-year gap in the middle. So this is at the end of his first term.
Okay.
All right. All right. A dozen past and present officers of the National Women's Suffrage Association collected in a large meeting room at the hotel, the Morrison Clark Hotel. in Washington, D.C. After greeting each other and milling about, the women sat about a grand cherry table. A set of portraits hung on the walls, all European men who fought for the nascent United States and its ideal of freedom for all. Frederick von Steuben, Casimir Pulaski, Gilbert du Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette, were all piercing gazes of these icons, were the piercing gazes of these icons condemning or egging on the women? Did the painted patriots see what storm was brewing? Matilda took the floor, pleading with her colleagues, we must stand together. She focused on Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her closest collaborators. Since we birthed the NWSA nearly 20 years ago, we've held strongly to the goal of full rights for all women. We've fought for employment, marital, and voting rights equal to those of men, regardless of a person's race, creed, or sex. Miss Anthony declared, for years I've heard Mrs. Gage argue for universal rights. Her support of those lofty goals seemed fathomless. Then, turning to Matilda, Anthony said, we've written extensively about these goals in pamphlets, editorials, and books. Matilda rebuffed, actually, Miss Anthony, in our publications, you essentially affix your name to my writings. Miss Anthony shot back, pish, that's of no matter. Where have these books and pamphlets gotten us? Coloreds. Matilda cut off her colleague. Why do you call black people coloreds? If you are indeed a co-author, then of all people, you should appreciate the power of words. When you use that word, you presume white is the standard for comparison, that white is correct, that white is supreme. Anthony snapped back. It sounds like you've been talking with my Frederick Douglass. Your Frederick Douglass, Matilda retorted. He is anything but yours, and you are most certainly not his. Miss Anthony sneered, I beg your pardon. Even Mr. Douglass understands that blacks, black men that is, were granted the vote by the 15th Amendment. Women, regardless of their skin color, were abandoned. We must work for that one right at a time. Matilda rejoined, Balderdash, are you going to abandon the goals to which all of us dedicated ourselves? Are you willing to focus on just the vote? Are you prepared to marry our National Assembly with the single issue American Women's Suffrage Association? Anthony chuckled. Yes, to all of your questions. I will erase the lines between church and state to achieve women's suffrage. I will even accept temperance and ally with the Christian acolytes. I am not beholden to you or anyone in this room. Miss Anthony's eyes bored into Matilda with a withering intensity. Matilda rose abruptly and left the room muttering. Mrs. Stanton followed her and confided, it's easy for Susan to abandon marriage and religious rights. Keep in mind, she is unmarried and calls herself a Quaker. Let's discuss this another time. Right now, we must attend the president's reception. Later that evening, dignitaries of the NWSA rode carriages down Pennsylvania Avenue. They dismounted at the executive mansion beneath the columned portico famous from daguerreotype images. Once inside, the honorees greeted Grover Cleveland and the First Lady, Frances Folsom Cleveland. The president received each with a handshake, a shallow bow, and the message, on behalf of our nation, we welcome you to the executive mansion. We appreciate your tenacious devotion to women's suffrage. The last guest to meet the president was Matilda. On seeing her, Grover's bushy mustache rose with a broad smile. His work-worn eyes twinkled as he gave her a hearty hug. It was all as if he did not want to let her go, possibly from fear that this was the last time he would see his dear childhood friend. It was wonderful to see you, Mrs. Gage, and a happy belated birthday. Gesturing to his right, Grover continued, let me introduce you to my wife, Frances. As gracious as the newspapers described, Frances greeted, "'Tis a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Gage. Come, tell me about my Grover when he was a child." Susan B. Anthony gawked as Frances linked her arm with Matilda's, and the two Clevelands escorted Matilda to the residence to reminisce.
Ooh, I want to know what happens next between the two women. I'm sure the book will tell us.
Yes and no.
Oh, that was wonderful dialogue. You could almost feel the tension between them.
Just to put that into perspective, Grover Cleveland was, and Frances Folsom Cleveland were adamant against women's suffrage, but he was a very even-handed president and believed everybody had the right to express him or herself, and debate was important for moving things forward.
That's really important to know. I didn't realize that.
All right. The second reading, let me just set this stage here for this one. This is young Cleveland. He's about 9 years old or so. And he loved to go fishing. He loved to go play games. And this is at a time after the new sport of baseball had been created.
Oh.
It was not created by Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown. For all those people, I don't want to be bursting bubbles here. It actually seems to have come from New York City, or at least took its hold first in New York City. And there's a little reference to that in this reading. But so this is in 1845, and it's a time when he was wasn't in school and just went off to go have a fun time with his friends. All right, so Limestone Creek, which is the creek that goes over toward the Erie Canal, which is the lifeblood of Fayetteville and much of upstate New York, and we can talk about that later if there's opportunity.
Right.
So the crusty, frost-laden field sparkled with thousands of tiny jewels. My oldest brother Will and I ran headlong through the field, crunching through the crinkly glass and shattering the morning quiet. Whee! Nothing was better than running about on a day off from school. Will and I adopted the far end of the meadow for playing baseball, a game that only recently arrived in Fayetteville. We staked our claim by hammering 4 short posts arrayed in a square some 50 feet per side. The farmer might not have been happy with us, but we did have the rest of the pasture for his Guernsey cattle to graze. On reaching the posted diamond, Will and I tossed a small round ball to each other. The ball was a present from Mother, who crafted it for Will for his 13th birthday just 3 days ago. It was already one of his prized possessions. Fortunately, he was willing to share. After all, you can't play baseball alone. Will winged it to me. A clap on my bare hands was immediately followed by me yelping from acute pain. Blazes! Don't throw so hard, it hurts! I turned 8 a month before. Barely concealing his glee, Will chuckled, I know, I'll be gentler. Will was strong. I looked up to him, if only because at nearly 5.5 feet tall, he was about a foot taller than me. We were merry co-conspirators, but he was always made it clear that he was in charge. In the distance, I spotted my brother Cecil running toward the field. He shared his first name, Richard, with Father, so he was always called Cecil. That is, except when Father or Mother were angry with him. Then he was called by both names. Cecil was 2 years older than me, but despite that, he was more than an inch shorter. He was kind, but he whined often and carried a frowny, pouty expression. Maybe that's why he was often a target of teasing. As he arrived, Cecil yelled, "Here I come! Will, throw it to me!" Will responded, "Okay," Sure hope others get here soon. I've only an hour before I've got to go work off her at the docks. They'll be here, Cecil droned. Then, as if to himself, he muttered, I hope they come. In short order, Jacob Cartwright bounded onto the field. Moments later, 3 more friends joined, George, Sam, and Rufus. All of them were classmates from Fayetteville Academy. Now, there were 7 of us. Each of us took a position on the field. Jacob picked up a bat while Cecil grabbed the ball to start pitching. When he was good, he was very good. On off days, which came all too often, he frustrated easily, wailed, and tantrumed. Cecil stared into Will, who coaxed, Come on, Cecil, put the ball in my mitt. Cecil twisted his body, unwound, and released the ball. Will waited, but the ball never arrived. Jacob swung the bat and clearly connected with the ball, and it flew over second base and bounced deep in the outfield. Jacob dropped the bat, ran to first, touched the post, and continued running. George chased down the ball, threw it to Sam, who stationed himself in the shallow outfield. Despite George's strong arm, the ball bounced on the dewy ground a few times before reaching Sam. By the time I collected the ball, Jacob was already standing safely at the post for third base. Having batted and run, Jacob came in to pitch, and Will took his turn at bat. While Jacob stretched, Will swung his bat menacingly. Finally, Jacob let the ball fly, fast and true. Will waited for the ball to arrive, took a rip with his bat. He missed, as if screwing himself into the ground. Embarrassed, Will challenged, Jacob, pitch another. Okay, here it comes. This time, Will took a sweet cut with his bat, squarely hitting the ball, and it soared over my head and bounced many times until it stopped 100 yards from the home base, under the cattle grazing in the far pasture. Will was fleet of foot, and he circled the base paths. Indeed, he was so fast and so full of himself that he ran around the bases again. George dodged the cows, corralled the ball, and heaved it to me. I had run to the outfield to relay the ball to Jacob, who stood by second base. In turn, Jacob threw the ball to Cecil, standing at home base, ready to tag out Will, who fell on the ground exhausted upon completing his 3rd time around the bases. Now it was time for Cecil to bat. He selected a slim bat that I had carved from a birch branch. Will took his turn at pitching. He tossed the ball, Cecil swung, and as he hit the ball, the bat cracked just above the grip. Splinters flew in all directions. Will disintegrated into hysterics, rolling on the ground in laughter. Cecil stood stunned. Holding the stump of the bat, watching Will, he realized that the bat had been tampered with, and Cecil grew red-faced. Will composed himself enough to yell to me, "Run!" Abandoning my position in the field, I ran. I ran for home. I ran up the mile up Main Street of our village as fast as I could, and I dared not to look back to see if Cecil was chasing.
I have to ask you, out of the whole book, why did you choose that?
Well,
I know you wanted to let us know a little bit about Grover, but that to me was so interesting. I'm watching you read it and I'm thinking, okay, so you must love baseball or you must have loved playing it, but why did you choose that?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it was a great way to introduce who they are, who the 2 Cleveland boys were that were really tight with each other, Will and Grover, and the whole idea of pranking is accurate to what he did when he was a kid, and a number of his pranks, historical pranks, are actually put into the book. And I thought that had a lot to do with who he was and who he was even after he was a child, when he started to become more responsible after his father died and he took care of his mother and his other siblings, that there was still this sense of fun all the time.
Interesting.
And it continued on throughout his whole life, even though he had to balance things with taking things seriously, like reading a bill from Congress or whatever it happened to be. But he was very good at compartmentalizing life. And when it came time for family or it came time for play, he was totally into that. So I thought that kind of set the stage for who he is and who he was.
I love hearing that. Is it possible you could tell us about one other funny, pranky thing that he did as an adult, maybe even as president? Does anything come to mind?
He kind of gave up doing pranks.
Okay.
When he became serious. Eventually he left Fayetteville.
He did.
When he was in his mid-teens, and he first went down to New York City to follow Will, who was a teacher at the New York School for the Blind.
Huh.
And he did that for a year because there weren't going to be many jobs to be able to stay in Fayetteville. It's a relatively small village. So he did that for a year, and then he said, this is not for me. Even though he really dearly loved and looked up to his brother, this just wasn't going to happen. So he went back to Fayetteville. He was there for another year or two, and then he went on his grand adventure. He was going to go to Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh, my.
Named after a distant relative, not Grover Cleveland.
Yeah.
But by the time he got to Buffalo, which is the end of the Erie Canal, or one of the ends of the Erie Canal, the other one being in Albany, Troy, he said, this is a happening place. I'm going to stay here. And Buffalo was a happening place. It was the second largest city in the state of New York, and it was the beginning of the West.
Yes,
the Wild West.
Right.
So he went there, and he never had a chance to go to college because his father had died, resources were less, and he wasn't able to go to Hamilton College, which is where his brother went. But he wanted to become a lawyer, so he became a lawyer by apprenticeship when he was in Buffalo. And he had a reputation for being a very earnest guy, and I can go into that if you'd like, but he also had the reputation for going to bars and really whooping it up.
Was he a dancer by any chance?
He was everything. And so, once again, when he was focused on play and on having fun, he was totally into it. And he didn't put up with, he was a big, burly guy. He didn't put up with people giving him a hard time. And he got into a number of fights as a result.
Well, I love knowing this about him because, honestly, I didn't know that much about him. He's not one of the presidents that we hear about very often.
Right.
But I'm curious. He was into a lot of things. He liked pranks. He seemed like he had a fun nature, but he could also be serious. But you tell a story of murder in your book.
I do.
Can you tell us just a little bit, without spoiling anything,
Well,
how he and his friend Matilda became involved in looking at a murder?
I'll try to without putting in too many spoilers in here.
Yes, please
Sure.
do not do too many.
So, as it happens, I've done the research, and I found that there were less than a dozen black people living in that part of Onondaga County.
Okay.
And who were, New York was a slavery, there was no slavery at all in New York by the time of the 40s.
Okay.
It had already been made illegal. So these were all free blacks. And there still was a fair amount of racism, to say the least, in upstate New York, as there was in many other places in the country. And in 1850, there was the fugitive slave law, which meant that any black that was considered to be or identified as a runaway or a fugitive from somewhere down in the South where they were enslaved, that they wasn't elective. You had to pick up that black and then return them.
back.
You were mandated to do that by this law. Matilda didn't want to put up with this at all. That's another story. Anyhow, blacks were living with this kind of aura, and there was a lot of resentment, a lot of racism and white supremacy in upstate New York that was going on. So there was somebody who dies in the Erie Canal.
And this is true.
No,
This-
that's not.
Okay.
That's
this
that's
is your story.
That's all me.
Okay.
And the question is, who was responsible?
Sure.
And how did this happen?
Who did
and,
it?
And that's what it's about.
All right. That sounds intriguing. So we were going to talk a little bit now as we're winding down, unless you have one more part you want to read, and that's
Nope.
totally up to you.
Nope. I'm good.
Tell us just a little bit more about New York at that time. And then I would like our listeners to know why this story is important to you. And you mentioned before that it's really relevant, some of it's really relevant in terms of what we're still dealing with today. So let's talk about that. New York was the capital at that time, I believe.
New York was the largest state in the country at that time. New York City was not the capital at that time. It was Washington, D.C. was the capital.
Didn't I read someplace that New York
Was originally the first capital, and that's where Washington was inaugurated.
Yes, right. Okay.
Yes.
But at this time,
And then it
now
went to
was
Philadelphia,
Washington,
and then it went to
Washington.
Washington, D.C. That all happened before the turn of the century. But the dynamics of New York, it became the focus of so much going on. You talked about the cauldron,
bubbling cauldron.
and all of that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah.
So that is all true because in New York it was like the birth of a number of religions which are still practiced in the United States.
Okay.
Easy one is the Mormon, Shakers.
Okay.
The Millerites, which became the Adventists. There are a whole bunch that came out of New York and are still practiced. Grover Cleveland's father, Richard Faley Cleveland, was a Presbyterian minister, and the traditional religions wanted to make sure that even in New York that they had a beachhead, that
Okay.
they still had a presence, and that led to some of the dynamics that are going on within the story. The other aspect of upstate New York is it was called the Burned Over District.
Why?
Well, it's an interesting, a funny story that the Burned Over District was identified or labeled by a man who used to be a lawyer and then became a guy named Finney and then became a evangelist, minister, and he was going around and he said, "There's no more kindling for me to convert."
Oh, boy.
So it was called the Burned
Burned out.
Over District because of that.
I didn't know that.
But in the middle of all of this, and what really made New York the dynamic place that it was, is the Erie Canal,
Yes.
which is a character in the story for all intents and purposes.
Yes.
Now, the Erie Canal was the brainchild of a man named Thomas Dewey, who was the, wrong governor, DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York, and he said, "I have a great idea. We're going to have a canal that goes from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes on the high side of Niagara Falls, so it can be totally open for things to go from New York City all the way to the Louisiana Purchase to the Great Lakes,
Oh, yeah.
and vice versa. So we can get raw products from there to New York City.
I see.
This is what made New York City the powerhouse that it is. And he had total control over this because it's only in one state. He didn't have to go to the federal government to ask for funding.
He could do what he wanted.
He could do what he wanted. Eventually, after a long, hard slog. He got it done, and it was done in 1825, and it just opened up the West. And all of these ideas that were being generated in upstate New York, all of these new thoughts of how you conduct yourselves and the abolition movement, all of these kinds of things moved over to the Louisiana Purchase space, over to Illinois, and just go on everywhere beyond.
What an exciting time.
That was what was going on up there in New York State.
I didn't know that, and I really enjoy you telling me about that. I did have an idea from when I read about it a long time ago, but this will bring it all back, and it will tie some people together that we know about in a really unusual way. So actually, I can't wait to read the rest of your book. But now that we're winding down, what would you like listeners to take away from your story? What do you want them to know?
Well, a lot of the things that, except for the pranking, of course, a lot of the things that that Matilda and Grover were dealing with, the white supremacy, the reflexive behaviors, the driving forces behind and the motivations for people are things that we're still dealing with today. And it's almost as if we haven't learned anything over the 150 years or 170 years since when this takes place to now. And so it's just a different way of looking at them and bringing these kinds of ideas forward.
Do you think you'll be replicating this in any way in another novel that you'll be writing? Are you going to talk about that same time in history?
Yes and no. I have written a second novel, and that novel is completely different.
Oh.
It more goes into science, and it talks about the birth of aviation.
Wow.
So it's a completely different time period. It's about 50, 70 years later, and it's another fun dalliance for me to pursue, and a little more in line with me being a scientist in things that I understand a little bit better than the history. But it's all fun.
I can't wait to read that one. Will you come back and read for us when that one's ready to go?
Happy to do that.
I like it. Thanks very much. It was great having you here. I learned a lot. There were two things that we didn't talk about that I'm just going to mention. Matilda was a devoted parent of 5 children. Her youngest, Maud, married Frank Baum. Do you know who that was?
I do know who that
Tell
was.
us.
L. Frank Baum was he was an itinerant actor, and he married Maud, who he met when she was at college in Cornell, one of the early women who attended Cornell College down in Ithaca. Mm-hmm. And he eventually, after a number of misguided ventures, started to write stories. He told stories to his children, and Matilda said, "You need to write those down." And she was a major cheerleader for him, and he wrote, among other things, the Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Isn't that great?
And what I like to think of is that Dorothy, who is named after one of the Matilda's grandchildren who died young from, I believe it was diphtheria, but don't hold me to that, that when you think of the Dorothy in the Oz stories, she is one of the early female protagonists that is strong, curious, driven.
Strong, curious, driven. I love that.
And when you think about her, and then try and go backwards, what I realize is that the feminist ideals that Matilda was advocating are basically instilled in that Dorothy. So Dorothy, in essence, is Matilda. Now, all of that on the side,
sure.
When you read the story, L. Frank Baum actually put Matilda and her husband Henry into the story.
Oh, his mom and dad?
No.
Who?
As Uncle Henry and Auntie M.
Oh, Auntie M.
M. Matilda.
Yeah.
So
Very good.
Those are his father and mother-in-law, and it was kind of like an honorary thanks. But Matilda never saw the actual book because she died 2 years before the first of 14 Oz books came out.
A wonderful factoid, and there's one more. Okay, so Grover had 2 non-consecutive presidencies. Yes, we know that. But we are going to talk about his child, Ruth. Tell us about her.
Okay.
Briefly, because we got to go.
Very briefly. Grover Cleveland had a child in the 4 years between his 2 presidencies, and Ruth was the darling of the media, and she was so much loved. But she did die, I think, at age 11, that somebody named a candy bar after her, Baby Ruth.
And you know what people think that candy bar is really.
I understand there is a misunderstanding that it is named after a baseball player who played for the Red Sox. Actually, when the bar came out in 1917, he was a pitcher for the Red Sox, but he was just. It was early in his career. There would be no reason to name a candy bar after an early career guy without any prospect that he was going to become the powerhouse hitter that he became.
Well, now we know the truth. And so as you mix truth with fiction, we want to know more about how you're going to do that in your next story. You've already promised that you'll come back and you'll talk about this. I want to tell you it's really been fun to have a conversation with you. I'm glad that we laughed a lot during it, and I hope our listeners leave learning a lot about your 2 protagonists who never really did meet and solve a murder in real life. I love the concept. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
See you later.
For listeners who are interested in finding out more or reading High Bridge, it's called, the name of the book, High Bridge, subtitle, Matilda and Grover Battle Learned Ignorance. And you can get this by going to your local bookstore and asking them to order it, or you can order it online through Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, which is an entity that tries to make books available by not using Amazon, or you can go to Amazon. So I hope you enjoy it.
This concludes today's podcast. We're always looking for new ideas, so feel free to reach out to Judy Raper, Associate Dean of Community Engagement at Greenfield Community College, at 413-775-1819 if you have an idea you'd love to share. Special thanks to the creators of Backyard Oasis, Denise Schwartz, Chad Fuller, Dennis Lee, and Christine Copeland. Have a great day.